Hi everyone, my name is Jeanette Adami. I'm going to do the introduction in chapter one to Bianca C. Williams' book, The Pursuit of Happiness, Black Women, Diasporic Dreams, and the Politics of Emotional Transnationalism. The introduction has a subtitle, Jamaica Crawled into My Soul. And this chapter really establishes the framework, as do most introductions for scholarly works like Williams' book is. What she does in this introduction is she establishes and identifies how African American women seek happiness and belonging by traveling to Jamaica. They use these trips, so these women use those trips to navigate really complex intersections of race and gender and emotional well being, all in the context of American racism. So, through this, she explores this idea of emotional transnationalism. And this essentially theorizes how Black women leverage physical and virtual mobility to create affective and racial connections all across the diaspora. So rather than these trips being these sort of escapist, leaving the realities of daily life for these women, they are experiencing joy on these trips. And that inherently is a means of political resistance against the racism and oppression that they are experiencing in the United States. Through these trips, these women form intimacy, sisterhood, and sometimes romance on their travels as well, which then helps them celebrate an identity that the United States and U.S. citizens and U.S. structures and systemic racism, that all of those sometimes have the tendency to criticize and suppress them due to U.S. based racism and patriarchy. This ties into the book that we read actually in our theory class by Camilla Hawthorne about Black Italians and identity and politics, because those activists also call for diasporic transnationality and transnational unity across diasporic identities, really to provide like a vehicle of political activism and maybe even be an alternative identity outside of the Western imagines of national borders. So I thought this was interesting to engage with both Hawthorne's and Williams' work at the same time, or kind of overlapping times. In her section, so in back to the introduction of Williams' introduction chapter, she has a subsection within this chapter talking about escaping John Henryism and Sojourner syndrome. Essentially, what this means is that Williams is outlining the nuances of identity for the women she studies. While they are technically lower middle class Black women in the United States, their class status is sort of diluted or superseded by their gender and their racial identities. So she talks about the story of John Henry, who proverbially works himself to death, and explains how what these women are doing on these trips, these girlfriend tours international, which I would assume would be broken down as GTI, but it's just GFT. um, that through these trips, these women are essentially engaging in self-preservation. It's this idea of when you're on an airplane and the mask drop from the ceiling, you got to put your mask on first. And the cultivations of joy and rest and pleasure, those inherently are the means of survival and resistance against intergenerational burdens. This then really harkens back and solidifies one of the quotes that Williams put at the beginning of the introduction chapter. It's a quote by Audre Lorde, and it says, quote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." So Williams really discusses the multiple sites in her ethnography. So after this sort of foundational discussion of what this emotional transnationalism means and the significance of an imagined community and the self-preservation that these women are engaging in, she then shifts to a little bit more of the technical side of this field work that she's completed to discuss the multiple sites of her ethnography. It includes virtual locations like Jamaicans.com, also the physical locations of Negril and Ocho Rios and other Jamaican towns. And then it also looks at some US cities. So I believe she goes to like Washington, D.C., Fort Lauderdale, and a couple of other locations in the United States that these women are traveling from in order to have these self regenerative trips in Jamaica. Williams is going to use a combination of observations, both online and in person, also trip reports and private messages and interviews, and all of the data that she compiles to engage in this transnational identity and study and diasporic identity and affect and Black feminist studies. Through all of this, these Black women's narratives and emotions and desires, they all reveal really crucial data. And sometimes the frameworks, especially in Western higher education, Western academia, sometimes reduce Black women's experiences down to their suffering. And Williams is calling for a push against that. She's saying that happiness is a radical political movement against racism and sexism. And this really highlights the power and privilege relative to operating within these imagined diasporic, or she uses the word imagine, I think created diasporic communities is a better, more fitting term, because they're not like, pulling this out of nothing, right? This is a real experience that these women are having. And it's through this leisure, laughter, and the pursuit of happiness that really have become the tools for rehumanizing their lives and their experiences. And it's a stark political critique of the United States and systemic racism. There's this interlude that transitions from the introduction to chapter 1. It's in June 2003 is the setting for it, or the summer of 2003, when she's visiting her grandmother in the hospital before her trip to Jamaica. And she's reflecting with her grandmother on kind of some of her grandmother's concerns about her being a single woman, or like an individual woman traveling abroad alone. And she's trying to ease her grandma, and her grandma at this point in the interlude is revealed to have been Jamaican born. So this is really her homeland ancestrally for the author, and then physically for her grandmother. And she talks about her grandmother's concerns really being generated from her grandmother's experiences on the island with hard times and poverty and abuse that's inflicted by men, and other terrible acts of hatred that other women have inflicted. And so there's this sort of push and pull that that she's seeing manifest in real time in her grandmother, or more so that she reflects on having been manifested at the time. Maybe she didn't fully realize it when she was having the conversation, but what she's identifying in her grandmother is this concern for her, but then also this sense of pride that her granddaughter is returning to her Jamaican homeland. And that probably her grandmother wanted herself to return to Jamaica, but wasn't able to because of her health conditions. So she discussed, then Bianca discusses how she goes to Jamaica shortly after this, and she's on this trip. And then a few days before she's scheduled to return to the United States, she receives a call that her grandmother has passed. And this really sets the groundwork for Williams as an anthropologist and her own positionality and her own reflexivity in this ethnographic field work, where, yes, she's going home to this ancestral homeland, but then she loses that crucial link of her grandmother that is that link back to home. So this loss really guides her interactions for the next 4 years when she engages in this ethnography. And she identifies 3 different places as being her home simultaneously during that time. One being Jamaica, another being the United States, and then the third being the Jamaicans.com web community, which she discusses a little bit more in chapter 1. So Williams asserts that women's travel to Jamaica is really a direct contestation of racism and sexism as it exists in the United States. So she shows how the GFT women's emotional lives, their desires, their leisure, their travel, all of that is shaped by this sort of push back against the intersections and the oppression that is experienced of racism, sexism, classism, and nationalism, again, in the United States. Globally, to a lesser extent, she's more so focused on the experiences that these women are having of that in the US. She discusses throughout the whole book, really emphasizing that women's happiness is in and of itself resistance. and that Black women in the United States are overworked, they're surveilled, and they're emotionally exhausted. So in order to really emphasize this idea of women's oppression in the United States, she draws on Black feminist work to depict the different kind of controlling images that Black women are so commonly situated within. This includes the Jezebel, the Sapphire, the Mammy, the strong Black woman. And she argues that this is really a reduction of Black women's experience, that these women instead, who are engaging in these transnational emotional well-being journeys, they insist on softness, on joy, on sexual agency, really to counter the narratives that treat them as either these problems to be fixed or bodies to be disciplined and tightly controlled. So, in that, these trips offer an opportunity for vulnerability that many of these women take and expand upon. Their emotional transnationalism thus becomes the mechanism for seeking emotional security, validation, and community that to them in their conversations with Bianca Williams, that they identify as feeling like it's unavailable for them in the United States. So as a consequence of that, the emotional transnationalism is a macro level power relation to everyday affect. And it really reveals how race and gender and nationality structure who gets to feel relaxed, who gets to feel loved, and who gets to feel at home. And all of those external influences are really dictating that in the United States, and then also dictate that in places like Jamaica, where these women have those opportunities. Williams uses Stuart Hall and Melissa Harris Perry to analyze how these women, and particularly the women on these trips, are really struggling for visibility and respect within a field that often saturates negative images of Black women. And these women, in turn, are seeking some recognition from Jamaican men, from Jamaican communities in general, but also from each other. And they use these tours as opportunities to be perceived by others and themselves as intelligent, desirable, and worthy. They know they are inherently these things. And so now they're looking for that external perception of them as these things as well. Now, throughout this chapter, we see different ethnographic scenes that Williams interprets as different rituals for collective practices of emotional release. She talks about this welcoming experience where they go to the hills and they look at the stars and they cry and they really just bring about stories for these women of struggle, of yearning, of escape, and of love. And so these women are really able to re-narrate themselves beyond deficit frameworks. And then they organize on these trips tours, group activities, and shared narratives that all build these temporary communities of care and also rehearse alternative ways of feeling and being. She also talks about, yes, these are temporary at the time, but then many people continuously call back to it. Like she identifies this woman whose name is escaping me at this exact moment, but she interviews her and she's talked about as like as having Jamaica holism, where basically she's addicted to these trips. She goes like 17 times in 8 years, and she's just obsessed with Jamaica. And then when the physical spaces are no longer being occupied, or when she is no longer occupying those physical spaces, she really takes it upon herself to draw on this online community, which I know is talked about in later chapters, so I won't go too far into that, but really drawing upon that to maintain this emotional transnationalism where she can be free, where she can be authentic, where she can be herself. So chapter 1 really insists that centering Black women's happiness, leisure, and pleasure is an essential and critical intervention in the scholarship and the public discourse about Black women, Black feminism, and what Williams is really contesting is that these middle-aged Black feminine, I should say, tourists are often erased in the depictions of tourism and sexuality and desire. And so in Williams' depiction of these women, we've expanded understandings of politics that include effective lives and rest and joy as really key arenas of struggle. And in doing so, the travels are personally transformative and analytically generative for reimagining diaspora, gender, and power. There's then the next interlude. It's pretty short. She meets her Uncle Noel. She talks about this sort of unique and energizing experience of meeting somebody who's related to her by blood, and this sort of bond that is automatically shared with them, but you technically don't know them. And then she describes his first words to her, and he says, "Where did you get that white man's nose?" And she's like shocked and taken aback, and she feels herself immediately getting defensive because she has this biracial father. And she's like, "This isn't polite. Like, you don't bring up race as the first thing you say to someone." And then she realizes that this is very ironic because during all of her field work, and in the, field work that's preceded this interaction, in the field work that follows it, this is exactly what she does. Is she meets people as this anthropologist, and she interrupts these people's vacations by asking them questions about race and racism. And so she's identifying the irony in that interaction that she has with her uncle, and then interactions she's having with others. And that's my summary of these chapters.